Hey everyone. I wanted to respond back to you guys about the pathophysiology discussion. And as I'm typing out all my comments, I realize that it's a lot of work to read all that stuff I write. So you get a video instead. I just wanted to address those topics that we are going to be that we talked about in the discussion, those very specific questions that we asked. And the first one is, what is perfusion? Now, because this is something that we're going to be talking about with every single patient that we look at, we are looking to see, is our patient perfusing adequately or are they not? Because this makes all the difference in the world. If we have a patient that has good perfusion, then they're not a critical patient, not at this moment. If we've got a patient who's not perfusing well, they are critical and we need to figure out why. So this is kind of the make it or break it. Either we've got a patient that's getting good oxygen and glucose to the cells or not. Okay, so the definition of perfusion is the delivery of oxygen and nutrients. For the most part, the nutrients is glucose. The delivery of those products to the cells and the removal of the waste products. Okay, if that is happening in a patient's body, they're in good shape. Okay, it's super important that we know this. Don't make it harder than it is. Okay, now there's lots of factors that play into making this perfusion concept happen. That's where we need to get into the nuts and bolts of this. So if you remember nothing else from chapter 8, remember the definition of perfusion. Now, hopefully you remember a lot more than that. Okay, so let's talk about when the patient is not getting adequate perfusion. So when there's not enough oxygen, now glucose is an issue, but for a person who is not diabetic, the body has ample means to store glucose to make sure that we always have enough. So the only time we really need to worry about glucose is in our diabetic patients. So for the remainder of this discussion, we're going to concentrate on oxygen because getting oxygen to the cells can be an issue for any patient, and we see that much more frequently than we do getting glucose to the cells. Okay, so when we do not have adequate perfusion or we do not have adequate glucose, I'm going to get you guys so screwed up. When we do not have adequate oxygen to the cells, then the body jumps in. It's got a system to try and compensate for that, and that's called the sympathetic nervous system, or that fight or flight response. Okay, that is triggered when the brain receives messages from the cells saying that they're not being adequately oxygenated. The brain reaches out to the adrenal gland and says, dump in some adrenaline or some epinephrine. Okay, when the adrenal gland releases that hormone, then the sympathetic nervous system is employed. Okay, and it has many different aspects. It works with multiple body systems to try and compensate for this in a very rapid and quick manner. So that sympathetic nervous system, okay, increases the heart rate, kicks that heart rate up with the intention of moving more blood around, hopefully with red blood cells and oxygen, faster so we can get oxygen to those cells who aren't having enough. Okay, it also increases the respiratory rate. Okay, if that respiratory rate kicks up, then we have more oxygen available to be delivered to the cells. Okay, and the last of the major things that it does is it causes vasoconstriction. System-wide, it's going to constrict those vessels. Now, we know our circulatory system should be a closed system. There shouldn't be any leaks. If there is, that maybe is the cause of our lack of perfusion. But if it is a closed system, if we take our pipes and make them smaller, we still have the same amount of blood and we still have the same pump pumping. So making the pipes smaller or those vessels smaller is going to increase the pressure. When we increase the blood pressure, we can move things faster. Okay, we can move the red blood cells and the oxygen to the cells and back to the heart much quicker. So those are the three components that happen when the cells are not getting enough oxygen. Okay, now other things happen with that sympathetic nervous system. Okay, it also dilates our pupils. Okay, remember it's called the fight or flight. So if our body decides or our brain decides that our body needs to fight, then we've got better peripheral vision and we can pull in more light with our through our pupils. Okay, it also kicks in the sweat glands because if we are going to run, fight, if our heart rate's up, if our system is working faster and harder, it's going to create more heat. And so the sweat glands are that automatic evaporative cooling system to keep our body from overheating. Okay. And the last thing it does is it starts to prioritize what part of this body absolutely needs oxygen and blood at this moment in time and what part doesn't. And so in a moment of crisis, our digestive tract and our respiratory system aren't essential. Now they will be long term, but for right at this moment, they're not. So the body literally shuts the blood flow down to those systems and diverts that blood and the oxygen to those systems that absolutely need it. Okay, so it becomes a matter of prioritizing. Okay, hope that makes sense. That is the sympathetic nervous system. It is employed in a time of crisis where the body gets into a state of emergency. It is stimulated by adrenaline that's produced by the adrenal glands, and those sit right on top of our kidneys. Okay, I hope that helps with that one. Okay, the next question was to describe in your own words how a cell creates energy under normal conditions. So for all of us that are healthy, our cells are creating energy each and every minute of every day under a process called aerobic metabolism. Now you can remember aerobic, okay? Takes energy to do aerobics. So aerobic metabolism produces a good amount of energy for our cells to be able to function. Now to do that, as you can see in the diagram on the PowerPoint here, takes oxygen and glucose going into the cell. Now I'm simplifying this. You can make it really complicated if you want. There's a process called glycolysis that works with the Krebs cycle. If you get deep into all of that cellular function, if you like it, if you like digging into that stuff, you should be a doctor or something, okay? You don't need to know all that for being an EMT, okay? Just know there's a process there that's going to take the oxygen and the glucose, break it down, and create energy. And it's going to create right about 34 units of energy, or what we call ATP, okay? That energy provides the cell with enough energy to perform its daily function, or to perform the function it's created for. Okay. Now the waste product in this, and this is important, the waste product in this whole cycle is, as you can see, whoa, down there, hang on here, I got all ahead of myself. Okay, is carbon dioxide. Okay, so just like your engine is running, if your engine is running optimally and doing everything it should, it's going to produce carbon monoxide. That's a waste product. We expect that to happen. Same thing with the cell. If the cell's functioning as it should, it will produce carbon dioxide, and we expect that to happen, and the body has a way of dealing with that. So what happens with that carbon dioxide? Glad you asked. It's going to move into the capillaries. Okay, it's going to go out of the cell into the capillaries. It sort of dissolves in the water, in the plasma. It's carried back up to the lungs, and we exhale it. Now that's a little simplified, but that is what you need to know. Okay, carbon dioxide goes to the lungs, and every time we exhale, we are exhaling those exhaust fumes, that carbon dioxide. Now, On a plus side, the presence of carbon dioxide when we exhale is proof that our cells are functioning in a healthy mode. So when we start to look at some patients that are maybe not so healthy, we can measure carbon dioxide and see how well the cells are functioning. It is an amazing tool. You're going to learn how to do that. It's called capnography, and we'll talk about it as we get a little farther into the medical issues. Okay, so knowing carbon dioxide is a normal waste product for aerobic metabolism, and all that indicates a healthy cell. Okay, now I asked you to describe what happens when the body does not have enough oxygen in spite of all of those compensatory measures. Remember, we talked about the sympathetic nervous system? So all of these, heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up, vessels get smaller, hopefully the blood pressure goes up. All of that happens, and it's still not enough to get oxygen to the cells in the amount that it needs. When that happens, the cell reverts, okay? It continues to try and make energy, and really right now it's in self-preservation mode. It's only trying not to die, okay? So it reverts to a process called anaerobic metabolism. Now, anaerobic metabolism takes the glucose, but it can't break it down like normal because there's no oxygen to do that. So it takes the glucose, it runs it through a different cycle without oxygen, and in that cycle, it's able to produce 2 units of ATP. Now, remember before we got 34. So these 2 units are not enough to keep this cell working for very long, okay? Here's the downside to this. The waste product that's produced in anaerobic metabolism is lactic acid. Now, if you can imagine what happened to the cell if I just poured acid in and around it, it's going to deteriorate that tiny little cell. It's also going to deteriorate the tissues and the little capillaries around the cell. Okay, so in pretty short order, although the cell's trying to stay alive, the lactic acid, okay, if you're in my class, I'll make you repeat this a few times. Acid is bad. Okay, lactic acid is bad. It deteriorates and it breaks down membranes. So it starts to weaken the cell wall. The cell wall starts to leak and deteriorate. The capillary outside of that, the lactic acid moves into the capillary, and it does the same thing to the capillary. It starts to break the wall down, make it leaky, and everything starts to go downhill in a very quick hurry. Okay, so that is anaerobic metabolism. That lactic acid is carried into the vessels and can get into the whole system, which means all of our vessels start to break down, all of our vessels start to get leaky. And when we start to lose the plasma out of those leaky vessels, we lose the blood pressure. And if you remember when we talked about how important blood pressure is to perfusion, if we don't have enough pressure to move those red blood cells and oxygen around, there's no chance we're going to have good perfusion. So when this acid moves into the vessels, those vessels start to get leaky and the plasma leaks out. We're going to lose blood pressure because we're losing a good chunk of our blood. The plasma part of it is leaking out. The blood pressure is going to drop, and then it's just a spiral downhill. Then it's a matter of time before our whole system fails. Does that make sense? I hope. Okay. So acid is bad. In anaerobic metabolism, if we don't get the problem corrected and get oxygen back to the cell, it's going to deteriorate because it cannot produce enough energy to stay alive, and the acid destroys it. Okay. And then the last probably complicated question that I asked was to describe or give an example of how our body often corrects an imbalance in pressure. So there was 2 things here. I did say think hydrostatic oncotic pressures, okay? A lot of you talked about baroreceptors, and so I think this is worth discussing. Okay, the baroreceptors sit in our arteries, and they are constantly measuring blood pressure, okay, for the purpose of making sure that we have enough blood pressure in our system to move the oxygen and the red blood cells around. Now, if you were to cut yourself and you started bleeding, let's say profusely, I mean, you were bleeding good, in those vessels, which should all be enclosed, because we now have sprung a leak, we're going to see the baroreceptors are going to pick up that drop in pressure. Okay? The way they're going to respond is they're going to send a message to the brain that says, hey, we've got a drop in the pressure, something's wrong. And the brain is going to say, okay, adrenal glands, release the adrenaline, and that sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in. Okay, it's going to cause the heart rate to go up, the respiratory rate to go up, and those vessels to constrict. Okay, make sense? If the pressure in the vessels get too high and we start to develop high blood pressure system-wide, so we're talking in the aorta, in those major arteries, then the brain is going to employ the parasympathetic nervous system, which does exactly the opposite of what the sympathetic nervous system does. So it decreases the heart rate, decreases the respiratory rate, and makes our vessels bigger. So it's going to lower blood pressure. And both of those work together. They're kind of like the gas pedal and the brake pedal. Okay. Sometimes if you want to maintain a speed of 70 miles an hour, sometimes you're going to have to push on the gas. But sometimes, like if you crest a hill, now we may need to put on the brakes to maintain that pressure or that speed of 70 miles an hour. That's kind of the way the sympathetic and parasympathetic work. They work together on an as-needed basis, okay? Now, the other part of the pressure thing was the oncotic and hydrostatic pressures, okay? So in the vessels, let's say we've got blood backing up from the heart, okay, because the left ventricle of the heart cannot pump as effectively as the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is pumping blood over to the left side, and the left side is like, I can't keep up. Okay, that pressure is going to back up into those vessels around the lungs. So this pulmonary veins that are around the lungs. As the pressure in those specific vessels get bigger, okay, that pressure increases. The baroreceptors aren't necessarily going to pick that up. That's not where they live. Okay, so we're going to call this pulmonary hypertension. So we have an increased pressure in the vessels only around the lungs because this is a heart problem. We have heart failure. Okay. So when that pressure increases, the baroreceptors as a whole are not going to be able to respond to this. And that's where hydrostatic and oncotic pressures come in. So as you can see in this vessel that we have here, okay, if the pressure in that vessel increases, the pressure, the hydrostatic pressure, pushing outward on the wall of the vessel is going to increase, okay? And as that pressure starts to increase, if there's no pressure on the outside of the vessel to match it, then it's going to push fluid, and it's water that shifts here, the plasma. It's going to push the fluid out of the vessel to relieve that high pressure in the vessel and to add some pressure to the outside. Now, once it pushes enough fluid out that those pressures balance, which is a state of homeostasis, remember, a state of balance. Once those pressures balance, then we're good, okay? The fluid shift will stop, okay? So let's reverse this and say we've got a patient that has not been hydrating well. Their kidneys are working in high gear to get rid of some toxins in the body. So the kidneys are pulling fluid out of the vessels to make urine and get it out. And this patient is not replacing that fluid. we're going to see that pressure inside the vessel start to drop. And the pressure outside the vessel, in this area out here beside the vessel, I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, the pressure isn't changing. So what that vessel's going to do, excuse me, what that vessel's going to do is it's going to start employing the oncotic pressure, and it's going to pull some fluid from the tissue outside the vessel and pull the water into the vessel to maintain the blood pressure. Okay, that's called oncotic pressure when it pulls fluid into the vessel. Now, those are going to be fluid shifts all the time. We are constantly shifting fluid because we're like 68% water. So we've constantly got fluid shifting back and forth to maintain that state of balance. Sometimes, if that pressure gets out of control, that fluid shift becomes much more pronounced. In the case of the pulmonary hypertension, the fluid increasing around the lungs, when that fluid shifts from the vessel to outside the vessel, when that oncotic pressure moves it out, what is outside that vessel on the other side is our little alveoli. And that alveoli is the air sac in the lungs. So when the fluid moves out of the vessel and into those little air sacs, it balances the pressure, but it creates a whole nother problem in the fact that we now have water in our lungs. And that's a bad thing. Okay. So that's one of those side effects of what the body normally does that works, that doesn't work so well in the lungs. Okay. So I hope this helps you guys understand. I hope it brings a little bit of clarity to what we were kind of looking for in this discussion. We'll take this forward when we talk about shock. Shock is a state of hypoperfusion or not enough perfusion. In chapter 15, we're going to talk more about shock, and we're going to see how do we recognize these signs. Now, I think you can look at the sympathetic nervous system response and say, well, if the patient has a fast heart rate, a fast breathing rate, and we can see signs that the blood is shunting to those vital organs and away from the skin would be pale, that is a sign that your patient is not perfusing well. Okay, so we'll talk more about that in chapter 15, but understanding these concepts is going to be vital to moving forward. So hope this helps. Dig into chapter 8 if you don't understand. Feel free to holler at me anytime. I'm happy to help you understand this. Have a great night.